Welcome, Thrivers, to this week's episode of Women Thriving in Business podcast. My guest today is my dear friend, Dr. Melba Nicholson Sullivan, who is the CEO of Freedom Flow Solutions. Welcome, Melba.
Hi, thank you, Nikki. So excited to be here and be in this conversation with you tonight.
Great. So let's just get right into it. So, Melba, tell us all about your business and what got you started on your entrepreneurial journey.
Okay, let me start with the business. That journey is quite the tale. So, Freedom Flow Solutions partners with organizations to reduce workplace stress and promote employee well-being so that organizations thrive. And my entrepreneurial journey, I am a licensed psychologist, a clinical community psychologist. The community part is the organizational psychology piece. And then the clinical is what people often think of when they think of a psychologist, working with folks who have diagnoses and having the honor of journeying with them. And psychology is one of those fields like medicine and law and the creative and performing arts, where you're trained to do the practice of the profession. And so like a significant percentage of folks go into entrepreneurship, but no one ever takes the time to teach us the business side. Like folks talk a lot about show business. Well, the reality of it is a lot of these other professions, there's a huge business side that no one ever talks about. So my entrepreneurial journey really started right after I finished graduate school, but it wasn't formalized. And I have a really good friend named Nikki Rogers who had a background in business. So it wasn't until about 10 years into my career as a psychologist, I've worked in every setting. I can officially say that. It's a big deal to me. Don't quite know why, but I have worked in every setting that a psychologist can work in. And I started consulting with the courts system. So different court systems like the juvenile court for children who are considered delinquent. I don't think we've evolved that much in the language, but that's for people who are under the age of 18 who've committed some sort of crime, and the court wants to know. I was doing what's called sentencing evaluations. So those are the evaluations where the court really wants to know more about their context that they grew up in and the recommendations that I as a psychologist had for rehabilitating them. So my career started in the Cook County Juvenile Court System, which is the court Cook County is Chicago, Illinois. Chicago is one of those places where people think it's the whole state, but it's not. Chicago, Illinois. It was the largest juvenile court system in the country. I think it may still be. And it had the two sides of the court. So two sides being both this piece around the sort of youth criminal justice side of it, as well as what's called the family care, the child protection side. So I was also doing evaluations around people looking at the termination of their parental rights. So I was doing that as an employee, and then I didn't want to niche into what's known as forensic psychology. So I moved into family practice because that's also where I started, was child and family trauma. And I started working for an organization, and on my it was a really interesting design because we had this revenue goal that we had to meet. And what I loved about it, which I think I'm now realizing is how I work with clients, with organizations, is like, get clear on the what. And then there was all this flexibility on how that goal is reached. And that just made it a lot easier in some ways, because if I got a speaking engagement, that would go towards my revenue goal. If I did a court evaluation, that would go towards my revenue goal. If I saw clients, individual children at school or with families, that would go towards the revenue goal. So I really sort of started this entrepreneurial thing, though I didn't really recognize it, when I was inside of a salary and benefits gig. And then I decided I wanted to pursue my dream of being Diana Ross, because if I wasn't a psychologist, I was going to be a performing artist. And I moved to California, and then I married somebody I met when I was in undergrad, and we moved to Nigeria. So I wasn't an entrepreneur in Nigeria in that sense of the word, like having my own business, but I was in the sense of like, here you are in a completely new context and you got to figure this out, and how much that's a part of that entrepreneurial, just like make it work. There's not a lot of guidance. I created the counseling center, so I wasn't stepping into a situation where I was maintaining what existed before I came and maybe editing it, but really in that creation process of how do we deliver services? What are the needs of the student? What are the needs of the university? What are the needs of the faculty? So that had some entrepreneurial energy, to it. But again, it was inside of a salary and benefits gig. So then I actually spent some time with my parents in St. Louis because I needed surgery, chose to have it in the US, and was doing some speaking engagements with the different schools in the St. Louis area. Again, I was doing these things, but I wasn't identifying myself as an entrepreneur. Got a gig in New York, and it took 6 months to get on payroll. It was just as I was realizing, oh, I should probably just sort of get a part-time job, just anything to get money. Just as I was about to sign a contract, the salary and benefits gig came through. While I had that salary and benefits gig, I was still doing the court evaluations, because the way that our system is designed and the way that the profession of psychology is, there are very few people who look like me who are doing the evaluations. But for example, in the state of New York where I live, 98% of the children and families in foster care are Black and brown. But the people deciding and sort of contributing to those decisions often do not look like those families. So it was a very sort of lucrative gig. And through my salary and benefits gig, I also got opportunities to be a subject matter expert with the US Refugee, Asylum, and Immigration and Operations team. So I was teaching, which was kind of a speaking engagement, but not, because there was coaching and curriculum building and really training officers on how you would interview asylum seekers and survivors of torture. And then I was doing adjunct faculty. So these are things that at the time I was doing them, you were the only person that was like, Melba, I'm gonna need you to legitimize your business. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, and I wasn't really pressed about it because I had a gig that was a false sense of security. And then there was a whole lot of lessons learned around that. So around the time that I woke up to, oh, this gig, actually, I'm being grossly underpaid and it's no longer a good fit for a variety of reasons. I'm not thriving here. I'm getting physically ill. My coworkers are getting feeling like it was just one of those experiences. And it was that experience of being a miserable worker. It really informed it in some of my other positions, because there's highs and lows in any gig, right? Joy and pain, Frankie Beverly and Maze. And it was like the pain was just lasting a little bit too long. And I realized it wasn't as cozy, it wasn't as comfortable, it wasn't as safe as it was. But what it did teach me is what I'm realizing is the genesis of what I do now, what Freedom Flow does, what the team and I do, which is this notion of it does not matter what you do for work. Like when I looked at all of my positions, I've been working since I was 15. It doesn't matter what you do for work. What matters is who you work with. What matters is how you're being with each other. And I really, really, truly believe that, both based on my experience and the experience of the clients that I work with. So when that salary and benefits gig became more painful than joyful, and the people that I enjoyed working with had moved on to other aspects of their career journey, then I really had to step out. And I chose to legitimize my business. The reality of it is I still have a number of colleagues who are in private practice that don't necessarily see themselves as an entrepreneur and don't necessarily get the LLC and the PLLC and all these different things. I was taught to do the measures. I was taught to do the therapy. I wasn't taught to do the business. So I legitimized it. I actually didn't legitimize it till the pandemic. So I always have this thing I say about COVID and the pandemics. It is a plural thing, which is that COVID in particular was like, how you living and how's that working for you? And so when I was sitting in that question with regard to my career, it was like, you living kind of wild out here with no safety net with regard to this business, literally traveling the world, but no safety net. And that's when I was overwhelmed by the paperwork and just didn't see myself being able to do the thing, like the filings and the this and the that. In COVID, I was like, yeah, how about I pay somebody? How about it be your time and your dime? This is worth the investment. And I actually legitimized 2 businesses in that context. So technically, I've been an entrepreneur for 3 years now, but I started with those court evaluations in 2003 or 4, like 20 years ago. So it's been quite the journey. And it wasn't until I was prepping for today that I was like, oh no, I now feel like I'm a legit entrepreneur. Like, okay, that's one of my identities. And I think it's because I've done this sort of reverse thing. I had the businesses, I was really doing it freelancing, so to speak, had a private practice and was consulting with different global human rights organizations. For a good 5 years, I've been doing that kind of work, and then moved into consulting with corporations, tech companies in 2020. And then because I did not have those business skills, that can only take you so far. So I built these businesses, they were doing really well. And then I reached the edge of my skills. I didn't have the sales and marketing skills. And so you cannot keep a consistent stream. Referrals only go so far. And then you have these contexts shifting so drastically in ways they never had. No, I don't know if there's been a generation that's had things just so fundamentally shift as often as our generation with regard to technology and then the pandemics. So that model of like that word of mouth thing just wasn't, the game changed when the virtual hit. And it really, in my opinion, required a level of skill for sales and marketing. And I could feel it in my business. I had an entrepreneurial gig. I was a successful entrepreneur for about a good solid 5 years. And then I took a leap and went and got a salary and benefits gig. So that's where I am.
Got it. So what I heard is a number of things that led you to becoming an entrepreneur. One is really thinking about on your career that you were diversifying your revenue stream, I'm going to say, and taking on different experiences while you kind of thought of them as it's freelancing and kind of side gigs, but they were really preparing you for your journey. And then something important that you really said is in looking at your last job before you stepped onto full-time entrepreneurship, of kind of taking stock and saying, A, I'm not getting paid what I feel like I'm worth. B, that this is starting to no longer be a fit. And C, or the third thing I heard was around kind of your physical and mental health. We're starting to be impacted by the job. And I think this is a story that a lot of people hear or a lot of people experience. And so as you were thinking about your mindset at that point in time and where you were saying like, this is no longer tenable, what was it that made you say, okay, I'm going to go out here and start this business full time versus say, I'm going to go take another job? Where were you at that point where you were like, this is the path I'm going to take and see where it goes?
That's a great question that I never really thought about before. Yeah, you know what? Honestly, what shows up for me is death. Bell Hooks has a quote or says something about like, Americans don't do death well. The American culture, and it's not the only one, is very committed to avoidance. And that's a whole other, right? Like very committed. And death in particular is, we don't turn towards it and really embrace it as a part of life. And I didn't think about this until you asked. The year before I left, like the salary thing, and I pushed pause on it for about 2 years, and then I got a part-time gig in addition to the entrepreneurial stuff. The year before I left, my best friend's father was murdered. And then the year that I left, my father-in-law died. And those moments, just that the trauma, I was shooketh. Our whole community was. But death, even when it's not that kind of surprise, it still invites, just like COVID, how you living? How's that working for you? And so those two things happened. I stayed in that contemplation place for a very long time, and I was applying for gigs and not getting them. So that also was another factor. I was applying for gigs and I wasn't getting it. And part of it was because when I put a trauma lens on it, being asked about my relevant work experience, which was the job I had at the time, was very dysregulating. So I didn't really want to talk about it. Avoidance is one of the key ways that we navigate trauma. So I wasn't showing up as my best, competent, capable self in those interviews because they would talk about, like I interviewed for one job and like the woman started talking to me about teaching undergraduate classes. I hadn't taught undergraduate classes in like 15 years. And what I wasn't saying was I am currently at a very prestigious place responsible for the trauma track. You know what I mean? Because there was just so, like, there's this Meryl Streep movie where she's talking to Leonardo DiCaprio's playing her son. And she talks about like, my feelings for you, Martin's Room, I think is what it's called. She says, my feelings for you are like a bowl of fish hooks. I can't just pick up one without all of it coming. So I couldn't talk about that prestigious job and all the things that I was doing and how overqualified I was for that position without all of that very recent pain coming with it. And so I just wasn't making it past the interview. So those opportunities weren't there, but those deaths really had me be like, life is too short. And also, honestly, the response of the person I reported to when I was like, I was like, I gotta go. Like, it was the middle of a work day. And I was like, in both instances, their deaths coincided with like the time of year that it was my thing that needed to happen. The project that I had been managing for the whole year and prepping the team to implement, I was not there because I was at these funerals. And so again, it called into focus, what is your priorities? And then the response of leadership in both of those scenarios was less than compassionate, was just sort of wasn't the culture to not have it be the main priority, to not have the work. I'm a human rights worker, and I say this often about the human rights field in general. I think there are ways in which, and it's why it's like the group of folks that Freedom Flow is really committed to working with, is because there's ways in which different disciplines and different fields are really organized to dismiss, deny, and minimize the well-being and the experience of their employees as they're doing this amazing service to the world. And those things kind of came into focus right when I was like, yeah, I'm complete, but that's what happened.
Thank you for sharing kind of what you were going through at that moment in time and this concept of taking stock, right? So for you, it was two close deaths, right? And then not feeling that the compassion from your employer, right? And then couple that with this was starting to feel uncomfortable anyway. And then they weren't showing up how you needed them to in the midst of that. Again, I think those moments in life are when you really start to think about what it is you want to do going forward. So, Melba, if you think about where you started and where you are now, so going back to when you legitimized your business, your two businesses, and what you thought you were going to offer or the type of work that you were going to be doing then, and then talk to us about where you are now, because I think a lot of people feel like they see someone out here and they feel like, oh, they just woke up like that. Like this is the business they see now is the business has always been. But for listeners who are really trying to disabuse people of this idea of perfection, your business doesn't have to be perfect when you start out. You don't have to do the thing that you started out doing for the rest of your life. You can start with one idea and morph to another. So can you talk to us a bit about how you've seen your thoughts about your business shift and maybe even what you're offering to your clients? How has that shifted over time?
Great question. I really do appreciate you bringing in this notion of perfection and this outcome focus where we don't think about the process. And also, what comes with perfectionism is the shoulds. So I thought because I was a licensed clinical psychologist that I should go into private practice, even though what I had evolved to really enjoy was training, was facilitating, was bringing in these diverse things like art therapy. And I was looking at bringing in drumming, like bringing in the creative arts. And even though that's what I enjoyed, I thought I should be in private practice. And it took me a long time to set it up. And then I crossed paths with it was exactly what I needed. Two Black women who had a private practice in Columbus Circle. And they were looking for somebody. You know, one of the things that I come back to when I get real stressed is what you are seeking is seeking you. And I thought I should be in private practice in this space. This wonderful space came up with great folks who we weren't even in the space a lot at the same time, but it was good energy. And so that's what I did at first. I got on different websites. I was really marketing myself as in my subject expertise, which is trauma. And I was doing EMDR and other forms of therapy for individuals, mostly BIPOC leaders. So leaders in corporate America, leaders in human rights, it's human rights workers. And it was challenging because I didn't want to do it. I thought I should do it. And I was good at it, you know, and I kind of had this reframe of, it took me a while to learn that just because I could do something didn't mean I wanted to do it. And didn't mean that that was the only thing I could do, if that makes any kind of sense. So I shouldn't say I didn't want to do it. I was enjoying it. There's something really special. And when I tell my clients it is an honor to journey with them, I mean it. Being a part of somebody's healing journey, that level of intimacy, and the way I practice is really like we're co-creating an opportunity for parts of you to heal, like as they show up so that they can heal so you can thrive and grow and really do the thing in the world. So I really do enjoy the therapeutic process. And it's not the only thing I enjoy doing. And it's not necessarily like the main thing I enjoy doing. So as I was doing that, I also had an organizational client where I was their in-house counselor. And in that position, I got to do a broad range of things. I got to do leadership management training. I got to work with specific teams. I got to travel the world, literally. I got to be a part of their conference. I got to do more of the organizational development and capacity building and training. And honestly, theater arts, that's my minor. I told you about that, Ross, right? That's my minor. Like I got to bring in more than just my clinical skills and expertise. I got to bring in the community psychology side. I got to bring in all of these organizational things. And so I was doing like this both and for this one organization because they were a global organization. So I was doing both the individual work as needed, as well as some organizational and teams things and really enjoying it. And so then I started to lean more into that. And this, mind you, was happening before I legitimized. So then when the world paused, the great pause, I legitimized both because I was doing both. And up until recently, meaning like last week, I was still doing both. And I don't know if it was the milestone birthday. I think it was. I think it was also my commitment to expanding my skill set as an entrepreneur and really getting real clear about who my ideal client is. And that led me to say, this individual level work is great. It's powerful. It's deep. And I also am getting irritated because these amazing people that I'm working with, highly resourced folks, are a lot of their pain is due to the organizational dynamics that they're experiencing at work. So I have a passion about workplace stuff. Let me go do that. Let me go create more space. And if I'm learning how to like really do the thing as an entrepreneur from a sales and marketing perspective, then I need to start somewhere and not be trying to do everything everywhere all at once, right? And then when I really sat with it, I was like, okay, this is the sweet spot for now, is really doing something with organizations, the kinds of organizations that human rights workers are in, or systems. Because what happens for organizations that are working with systems involved people is a lot of times their employees have experiences that parallel the people they serve, and really come at it from a relational perspective, from an organizational context, because that individual piece, there is a place for individual. And I think there's just a little too much emphasis on like the individual. You know, I always kind of joke, go do some yoga or go use this Calm app or do some mindfulness, right? I remember working with somebody once, and what they said was, because it's a common thing for a lot of companies now to have like free subscriptions to these apps. And the person was kind of like, miss me with your app. Because when I'm working with somebody individually, I'm working with them to navigate the impact of a work environment that needs to change. When I'm working with the organization as the client, I'm changing the context that individual is working in. So those apps, they were like, miss me with your app. I want you to train your leaders to lead. I need you to train the supervisor to not be calling me out my name or not be emailing me in the middle of the night talking about, don't read this email. How about you set up a deliver it in the morning thing? So those are the things that I found to be a lot more jazz. And then honestly, when I sat with it, that's also my master's and my dissertation were about organizations and how organizations promote the positive development of people, particularly BIPOC people. So in some ways, it's a full circle moment, but that's the journey. Like I thought I should do individual therapy because I'm a psychologist. And I gave myself permission to be a clinical community psychologist and really lean into the organizational and the community and the family and the relational side of things and sort of speak to the individual, but not have that be the primary focus.
I love that you are still a work in progress from like what your business does, but that you are focusing in on the things that you care most about and where you can have the most impact. And it sounds like that was informed by you doing the individual work and saying, like you said, you're working with individuals, but realizing there's a bigger issue here. And we can do all this great and powerful work together. but then they still have to go back. They still have to go back into the situations, and there's only so much you can do at the individual level. And it's
Yeah.
almost like you're creating a brace, right? Like, I'm armoring you up so you can brace yourself to go back into this environment.
The only individual piece is when we start to get into coaching and leadership coaching. If somebody has the positional power within an organization, yeah, I'll work with you individually. Because the shifts that you make individually, small organizations take on the nature of their leaders. So those leaders shifting, broadening their lens, understanding the value of relationships, understanding different protocols and procedures and how that can really just create so much space and psychological safety. Yes. But the individual clinical work where somebody's got a diagnosis because they're having I will not get on my soapbox, but all of the language in that clinical space is based on disorder. When one of my colleagues used to say, and it's the truth, right? You talk about something like post-traumatic stress disorder, and there's two ways in which that's not named well, right? One, it's not post, and two, it's a natural response. It's not a disordered response. So I'm working with people individually, and they're having like natural responses, and they're kind of being held accountable for messed up organizational dynamics that are very addressable and actually would cost less money to address it that way and be more effective. So that's just underlining what you said, right? Like this working with the individual, I'm like, no, it got to be frustrating to shore them up and send them back in, particularly if they didn't have certain kinds of positional power, which oftentimes they didn't within the organization.
Yeah, that organizational component. So you like you said, it's very addressable and probably would cost less money, but it requires people to be different. And that is often, no matter what the cost is, like that change, that different approach, that different perspective, that paradigm shift, even though we've been in the mother of all paradigm shifts, I think people still want things to go back to whatever it was. And, I think the status quo is a real thing that you have to fight. So, as you're working with these organizations, how do you get them to shift? What are some of the real world, I'm going to say, techniques, the language? How do you explain the imperative to folks who really just, they want to be different, right? But they don't want to change.
It's really interesting because that was the other gift of, I have some socks. I wish I could show them to you. They say imperfectionist. Myself becoming and having because it's a practice, right? You don't arrive, and I forget. Becoming an imperfectionist set me free because I started doing what I wanted to do, and it was just so much easier. It was easier to make the case because I knew it. I've been there, done that. You know what I mean? I could talk about being the miserable employee. I could talk about the sort of unspoken and informal expectations of being a health provider and a human rights worker. And even sort of breaking down some of that language about empathy and sympathy, empathy, and compassion. Of like, there's a way in which some of the ways that we are trained that's just sort of baked into it actually undermine our capacity to show up. And so I could also speak to the things that other folks aren't speaking to, and I could hear it. So working with organizations and how much of your team's time is being spent providing emotional support. How do we talk about this in a way that is really true? It's not about productivity, but the frameworks and the paradigms that we have to talk about this all come from a capitalistic paradigm, which is productivity, productivity. Like there is a distinction between engagement and productivity, and they are related. I have the numbers, right, about as that engagement goes up and as the employees thrive, it produces innovation growth, all of that. But really being able to talk about it in the unique context of what it means to be an organization that's navigating the immigration court system or that's navigating the healthcare system, what that means to be a worker in that system, an employee in that system, a leader in that system. How do you create space for the stories and the healing journeys that your team is on, and the reality that you got to have some boundaries that allow you to show up and do the work and not get stuck and overwhelmed. So the moment that I gave myself permission to be more integrative and to follow what I was truly passionate about, it became so much easier because I was describing scenarios and they were like, they felt so seen. They felt very Lauryn Hill, like, very Lauryn Hill, Roberta Flack, let's get it straight, right? Right, like strumming my words with his finger, right? Like singing my life with a song. It's like, I'm saying, they're like, have you been here? And it's like, no, I just know. I know what I know from all the time that I spent with those individual workers. I know that everybody is impacted by this work. That's also not something that often gets talked about, particularly in systems that are sitting with the trauma. And I also know that certain people don't, you say trauma, they're not seeing themselves in that conversation. You got to talk about it as stress. So I talk about it in that way. I talk about it as like what you can do. So bringing in a lot of positive psychology. It's very rare that I'll talk about burnout. I listen and I think about who they are reading, and I use some of that language because it really captures it. But I cultivate that buy-in through really allowing myself to be imperfect and allowing myself to be vulnerable and very sort of direct about, like, these my stories from like they used to have that show Tales from the Hood. It's like tales from that human rights life, tales from that healthcare life.
So you're really changing the conversation. That's what I'm hearing, is because I think with human rights organizations, with human services organizations, the focus and emphasis has been on the outcomes, has been on the beneficiaries, has been on the client. And what you're really talking about, and those are the products. I'm going to say products, outcomes,
I mean,
impact.
they use the word consumers.
Yes. So that has been the focus. But if you've been a part of these organizations, the process is the belly of the beast, right? And so while these organizations have these wonderful, glossy year-end reports, what's going on inside the organization is often less than stellar. And the types of folks who are attracted to that work are often more likely to come from identities that can be adversely impacted by being in an organization that is not set up to support those who work there.
And the other thing that is really interesting is I am bringing some of the business language, not necessarily sales and marketing, but these organizations are very mission driven. They're very passion driven. They often start as the passion of a very charismatic personality. So just naming some things that people haven't necessarily thought about before, like founder syndrome, or things that are talked about all day, every day in the business world, what it means to go from one generation of a leadership to the next generation, or to talk about the developmental life cycle of an organization, even to say something like small organizations take on the nature of their leaders. People are like, oh, yeah, right. Like they can see how that leader maybe struggled with boundaries, and that became the expectation for everybody. Well, when you are in a human rights context, you got to have boundaries, and it's not to shade or shame or blame, but kind of linking it back to where I started. There are a lot of professions, particularly in these human service organizations, we're not trained in business. We're trained in the content of what we do, the outcome. We're not trained in leadership. Marital family therapy is the only discipline that requires that their supervisors take a class and have their supervision supervised for 2 years. And then they have to take that supervision class again after so many years. So that does not happen in medicine, psychology, so none of the other ones. That's the only one that even starts to approach being intentional about supervision and how you're training your people, how you're relating to your people. So there's a huge gap there in terms of understanding leadership, in terms of understanding management, and in terms of really talking about the impact of the work that you do, what it means to work with people who are looking at the termination of their parental rights, who are seeking asylum and they've been in the immigration courts for 10 years. And to understand that it's not just your therapists or your social workers or your lawyers, it's your front desk person. So some of that structure and some of that, a lot of times I'm talking to organizations and it's their leaders about, you got to move from a charismatic personality to just systems and structures that exist beyond who's sitting in any seat at any given time.
And so when you're talking about that, like growth and scale, that usually applies again to what are the outcomes, like how much money are we raising, how many services are we providing, et cetera. But that growth and scale also has to apply to how do we mature this organization. bring in some of those business pieces without losing the humanity, right? But because it's
Exactly.
not about profits, but it is about there is infrastructure that is required in order for you all to have the impact that you want to have. So, how do you grow up in a business? When you talked about having those touch points with the folks who are providing care and how that impacts the folks who are providing the services, it reminds me I volunteered with this organization in Sao Paulo, Brazil, where they actually would go out and support street kids. And part of what they had to do was go out and walk the streets to tell kids about the services that were available or find kids they hadn't seen in a while, and they were legal aid, but they provided so much more. And one of the things they did every week is have like a group therapy session for all those who were involved in order to talk through. And this is beyond like sharing case notes, right? This is really
Mhm.
talking about the impact of the work that they were doing. I went on a street, they called it a street walk. I went out there one day and I was like, you know what? This is not something I could do every day. It was heartbreaking because one, you can't help every child, and every child was not in a position to come and seek help. And just seeing that over a period of time, I was like, my goodness, like just what do you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis to just come to work every day? I was awed, I was taken aback. It was a lot emotionally, physically, and this is just me doing that one day. After that, I was like, "You know what? I don't hang out in the office. I'll work with the kids when they come in here." I couldn't do that on a day-to-day basis.
And that part of what you're talking about is also like, right, there's the space for people to process. And for some folks, that'll be sufficient. And for some folks, they're like, that's the last thing I'm going to do. But the other piece that you're describing, that's the other kind of thing that we talk about that our team does. And we do that a little bit more than we do the sort of processing, which is how do you create one of the things that you need to have is diversify work experiences. If you want this to be sustainable, then folks need to have choice, right? So they get to choose how much time are they spending in the front desk or in the office doing administration? How much time are they in the street? But oftentimes organizations haven't thought about that. Everybody, like people have very rigid roles that they might be playing. And they don't necessarily think about, oh, if you had a policy where people got to choose what they did or maybe had input, they don't even have the final word, but create space for them to say, hey, it would be awesome if I spent like half my time on the street and half my time in the office, or had building in check-ins in your weekly meetings. Like there are different ways to think about how you're structuring, how you're relating to each other. And that is probably what we center the most is how are you being with each other? How are you relating to each other? Are you creating space for choice? Are you transparent about your decision-making processes? Are you saying, I don't know when you don't know? Or are you saying, I'll get back to you and you never get back? Or are you coming up with these dictates? So it is all of that because those positions are really hard and people don't necessarily, a lot of folks who are in them because of the nature of trauma, they may be numb. And because of the nature of their training and a variety of other factors, they may feel it's selfish and inappropriate to acknowledge this is hard. One of the things I would say often with human rights workers is we gaslight ourselves or we don't include our humanity. We don't give ourselves permission to complain about the weather or our housing or our food or our relative because we're working with people who haven't seen their loved ones in years. So we get in sort of this comparison and this Olympics of suffering versus creating space. I'm human and I feel a way about the things that are happening in my life and about the things that I'm hearing.
Melba, as you think about your entrepreneurial journey, what would you say have been both your biggest challenges as well as your biggest accomplishments?
My biggest challenge it continues to be being a recovering perfectionist. It continues to be the shoulds. It continues to be exactly what you were saying earlier of like, I look at other people and I'm like, I should have arrived. Like I forget their journey, I forget their process, and I forget that it is a process. I'm this person that jumps all in and then I'm like, oh, ooh, okay, wait a minute. Right. Like, so getting out of that sense of urgency and that sense of like everything has to happen all at once right now and moving and staying in the step-by-step process, honoring my process, the unique, wild, adventurous journey that it is, and understanding that that is like just accepting it. That's what it is, and celebrating that. I am somebody who doesn't spend a lot of time celebrating and acknowledging the steps along the way. It is all or nothing. And that is the lesson that I'm having to be with. My biggest accomplishment has been really centering consistently, individual and collective practice. So, what I mean by that is I got a lot of stuff on my paper. And the stuff on my paper, meaning like on my resume, on my Vita, are me moving through systems that really are all about the outcome and sort of having me think I did it on my own. And so for a lot of times when I was suffering, when I was having problems, I wouldn't tell anybody. I was training to be a therapist and had never been to therapy till like 5 years after I had my degree, like years. I had to get really in a lot of pain before I was like, oh, maybe I'll go to therapy. That's ridiculous in some ways, but I know I'm not the only one. So this piece of like, there is absolutely nothing in life that I am navigating that I have to do on my own. And so I'm super proud of, even though I may struggle to show up, I still have figured out that this too can be held in community, whether that's a community of friends, whether that's a community of coworkers. It does not take me nearly as long as it used to be struggling with something and phone a friend, be struggling with something and tell my husband, to be struggling with something and turn to a coworker and be like, ooh, child, that was hard. This is hard. And not even asking somebody else to fix it, but to really bring it to this, like, I can do it. And right, that individual and community practice, it's those three words. It's a practice. It's a practice, and it's never ending because it's a practice. This practice of turning to a friend, this practice of reminding myself what I want to be able to say about this a year from now, 6 weeks from now, and really trusting my own agency and capacity to practice and to practice in community. That has been a really, really tough lesson for me to learn and a tough practice for me to develop. And I now feel like I'm never going to arrive, but I'm just noticing like that therapist in me comes out. It's about reducing frequency, duration, and intensity. And so it doesn't get as intense before I'm like, hey, it doesn't last as long. And I'm doing it more and more often than I ever did.
I think that's a great accomplishment. A lot of us as entrepreneurs, a lot of us, I say particularly as Black women, that recognition that you don't have to do it alone. You don't have to carry that burden, that there's other people who can help you and help you quickly. Like whatever thing you're struggling with, there's somebody who would be like, oh, it takes 30 seconds. Like I can take care of that. Right. So I think that is a really important accomplishment and lesson to learn that there are others out here who can support you. You don't have to struggle. That's a great lesson to learn. Like there's
Mhm.
no gold medal because you struggled the most.
Right.
So,
Right. Like there's a whole, I think it's a Buddhist phrase. It's like we all experience pain. We choose whether to suffer. I'm not the Christian my mother raised me to be. And I still think in music, so that Aretha Franklin version of what a friend we have, like that's also what that's about. What a friend we have in Jesus, what a friend we have in spirit. Like this idea, like you suffer because you trying to carry that, all because we don't carry. All because we don't carry everything. You know what I mean? To like, we ain't got to do this on our own. And I mean, there are narratives that get told, that get framed that way, but there's this interdependence. And there's, like you said, there's nothing that any of us are ever doing alone even though we think we are.
right. And it's, knock on the right doors. The thing that you're asking, I think earlier you said what you are seeking is seeking you. And so you never know if your dilemma, your question, your request is the answer to somebody else's dilemma or request. You're not burdening people. The people who feel burdened by you asking something, okay, they're not your people anyway. But for somebody, you're offering them an opportunity to be of service. You're offering them an opportunity to showcase a skill, to build a skill, to like, there's always something. And I think about it like, just like sometimes I want to be helpful for others, somebody else wants to do that for me. So who am I to not
Mm.
allow them that opportunity?
One of the things that I would talk about with people in individual therapy, because one of the ways that we take care of ourselves when we've had an experience that was too big for our brain to digest, right? Because I talk about trauma is to the brain what food is to the belly. When we eat too much of it, it's just hard for us to digest it and take what serves us, helps us feel stronger. Is this like we will over control? We will try to control, even though we cognitively know like that's so not a thing ever in life, right? And it is much more difficult to receive for some of us than it is to be the giver. And because when I give, I get to dictate who I give. When I receive, I got to be like mad vulnerable. And oof, that's been really the pieces of what you said of like being in a place of making the request and then receiving it, because that's two different things. And also this piece around understanding that I bring something of value.
Yeah, I think you talked about the vulnerability and it's reciprocity, and it's not necessarily reciprocity with that person, that individual, that person. It's universal reciprocity, right? So I might not be able to help that person who's helped me, but then I can go help someone else, right? And so I think it's about that energy, it's about that spirit piece of what you do does come back, and maybe not in the shape or form that you gave it, right? But it does show up when you need it. So Melba, it has been great chatting with you, but before we get out of here, there are two questions I ask all of my guests. So the first one is, what are one or two songs that are on your power playlist and
Oh, wow. Wow, 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 wow. One or two songs on my power playlist and why? You know what? I keep coming back to Fertile Ground, Live in the Light. Some of it is like the literal words, like when things feel heavy, when I find myself shrinking, just being reminded, live in the light. Plus the beat of it, it's just like you can't not like move to it. So Fertile Grounds, Live in the Light. And my second one that's coming to me in this moment is Donnie McClurkin's That's What I Believe. I played it when I was driving to defend my dissertation. And just that whole, it calms me to get to remember that this is what you were talking about a minute ago. There's like some universal laws, and so much, particularly where I'm standing now in the level of uncertainty that I'm standing in right now, just this faith walk, this take that step and trust that the stair will be there, or you will land and it won't be like plummeting, right? Like just being reminded, that's what I believe. Like you said, you deliver me. You said this whole notion of, you said if I create a vision, you said that the universe is abundant, that what I am seeking is seeking me, and that the universe is for me, nothing and no one can be against me. And that's what I believe, right? Those aren't the lyrics of the song, but ultimately that's the energy of it. And that's what I believe.
and what is one book that you would recommend that has helped you thrive in business?
I'm just going to go with like top of what comes up top of mind. And it is Barbara Stanny's Overcoming Under Earning. I actually have two, but that's the one that really supported me in getting clear about how I was moving and how limited my vision was for the business and what was driving that. So yeah, Overcoming Under Earning by Barbara Stanny. And the second one to that is How to Stop Feeling Like Shit. And I don't remember the author of it, but I just thought it was.
The provocative title.
I think it goes by its acronym. I'm sure for a variety of reasons, but yeah.
Well, Melba, if folks want to learn more about you or your business, where can they find you?
They can find me at freedomflowsolutions.com. And I'm also on LinkedIn as myself, Dr. Melba Nicholson Sullivan.
So, Melba, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It has been great chatting with you. I even learned a few things, which is amazing after all these years. So, thank you for being a guest.
Thank you for having me. Truly appreciate it.
All right, Melba, take care.